Hey, everybody. We'll just wait a second. I can see people are still coming into the session. We'll just wait 1 second here. Looks like we got about 60 or so folks. Okay, my buddy Brian's here. Brian, what's up? Love seeing people I know in the community. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the OpenTofu Foundations Workshop. I'm Corey O'Daniel, CEO of MassDriver. I started this company because after working with so many DevOps teams, I saw firsthand how they struggled to adopt DevOps practices and infrastructure as code. And it kind of became clear that while the cloud was promising simplicity, the reality of scaling infrastructure across your organization is often much more complex than scaling compute. We're a part of the team that forked Terraform at version 1.5, and over the years, we've seen where a lot of people tend to get stuck. At MassDriver, we focus on solving these pain points, especially when it comes to scaling adoption across teams. You can kind of think of us as a platform as a service for your developers, but entirely customized by writing infrastructure as code. The fact is, adoption of IAC is tough. If you've seen the State of CD report, you know that it highlights some of the struggles that teams face. Only 30% of orgs have adopted IAC. So if this is new to you today, you aren't behind. You're the norm. So you're taking a great first step at leveling up, and I love that. What we're doing at MassDriver is taking the headache out of scaling infrastructure practices across the org, so your teams don't waste months or years of their lives wrestling with the complexities of building developer self-service and internal developer platforms. Instead of dealing with the day-to-day grind of managing infrastructure, your ops team gets to focus on strategic, high-impact work like security and architecture, while your developers get to build the features that drive your business forward instead of fiddling with IAC all day. Everyone gets to spend more time working on stuff that really matters and less time on the bullshit. In this workshop, you won't see a ton of MassDriver-specific content until much later, around weeks 5 through 9, and only for a few minutes. We really want to help folks start adopting IAC. That's the goal here. So we're going to show you how to do things the hard way and then show you how MassDriver can make the tedious and boring parts disappear. So with that, I just want to kick it over to one of our advisors, Kelsey Hightower, to share a few words, and then we'll hop into the session. Hey, Kelsey.
Oh, dope. I'm on. Look, I'm excited. I remember when the fork happened, the biggest question I think a lot of people have, like, you're going to fork Terraform, now what? And I guess this is the now what. I remember giving my kind of first workshops when Kubernetes came out. So I just know how important this part of it is. I won't be able to stay the whole time, but I am going to be watching the recording, stick around as long as I can. But yeah, this is the dope part. I got a bunch of questions like how different is this than Terraform? Where are we at? All of those things. So, hey, everybody, I think I see someone there from Lisbon. I was just there 2 weeks ago. So nice to see you. Got a global community here, man. So congratulations on this workshop. I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks, Kelsey. I really appreciate it. Yeah, so here's what we're going to cover today. So we'll begin with just an introduction to OpenTofu. We'll talk about a couple of just core concepts. We'll do just a few slides, and then we're going to hop right into code. We're going to build just an EC2 instance and connect it to RDS. We'll organize the code, deploy some infrastructure, connect the services, and by the end of the session, the goal is to have a pretty solid foundation of just how to use the OpenTofu CLI. The goal today, so if you're like a hardcore security person, if you've been working in AWS for years, you're going to be like, wait a second, that's not the way to do that. Today's goal is not to be an AWS expert. I'm actually trying to keep it as minimal as possible so that we can focus on the OpenTofu parts. But yeah, we'll have some running infrastructure by the end of the day, and everything stays in the free tier. So feel free to follow along. We'll post the code on GitHub, and we'll post the walkthrough of this session on GitHub as well as the video afterwards. If you haven't joined our Slack community already, we have a channel there called OpenTofu Foundations, where you can ask questions about infrastructure as code, OpenTofu, what you're trying to build, and any of the additional challenges that we put into the sessions that you may have questions about. So let's kick this off. Make sure I'm sharing the right screen. So first off, what is infrastructure as code for the people that are completely new to it? It's the practice of managing and provisioning your infrastructure through machine-readable config files rather than manual processes like ClickOps. The approach helps you automate the setup of your infrastructure, helps you ensure consistency and reliability across deployments. But I think one of the most important parts of infrastructure as code is that you get to leverage version control and pull requests and collaborate with your team rather than somebody just kind of clicking something and building it off to the side and nobody knowing like how it got into the state that it is today. There are a ton of tools in this space, a lot of great tools in this space. OpenTofu is the one we're going to be focusing on today. And one of the key things about OpenTofu is that it is declared infrastructure as code. So what we'll see here is we're going to focus on the desired state of our infrastructure rather than how to get there, right? So if you've been automating your infrastructure with Bash or Python or the AWS CLI, it's a lot of if this, then that. And with OpenTofu, it's just this is what I want. And the IAC tool kind of takes care of how to get there. So what is OpenTofu? So OpenTofu is a backward compatible fork of Terraform 1.5. It's open sourced and community driven, benefits from contributions from around the globe. I think one of the most important strengths is, yes, of course, the support with existing Terraform modules, which is great. If you already have Terraform, it's a really easy transition. I, as a matter of fact, have an alias on my machine that randomly swaps the binary. So I generally never know what I'm using. That's how compatible they are. But I think the most important thing about OpenTofu is that it is a part of the Linux Foundation. It is going through CNCF, and we have an open RFC process. So the community decides what goes in OpenTofu, not a single vendor, which has plagued Terraform for years. Supports a wide range of providers, making it versatile for different cloud environments. And it's licensed under MPL. So you've got the flexibility and compatibility for open source and proprietary projects. So that was a lot of words. I know we're all nerds here, so let's code. Again, if you haven't checked out the Slack, go ahead and join that. Feel free to follow along as I go. We're going to start with a blank slate and build this thing out. Let me just share my screen really quick. Here we go. Okay. Let me just go ahead and get this up here. There we go. So we're going to start with an absolute blank slate today and start building out these EC2 and RDS resources. So the first thing I'm going to do is kind of talk through what we're doing in OpenTofu. I'll talk through some of the keywords that we see, and then we'll use the command line over here. So there you go. I know how to use this thing. I actually never use help because I know it all. But I'm going to use the T alias a lot just because that's my muscle memory. But if you've already got the Tofu tool installed, fantastic. Hopefully you went through the rest of the prereqs if you're following along. So the first thing I added over here was just some configuration to configure the provider that I'm going to be using in this module. And so when you're working with OpenTofu, you can have many different providers. You could have AWS and GCP in the same module if you wanted to. There's local file providers. There's providers for managing TLS. There's a provider for pretty much every cloud out there, literally hundreds of those. And so what I did is something I just kind of did already just to kind of save us a couple of minutes was I put these providers in here already, and then I ran tofu init. And what this does is it downloads all of the tooling so that I can interact with the AWS API. So these providers are kind of just abstractions that sit in front of the cloud APIs. So that's the only stuff that I've kind of done in this project so far to get this going. If you are following along, that was a lot of little code right there. You can just copy it from the GitHub repo. There's a providers file there that has this all in there. And let's go ahead and get cracking. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a file called main.tf. And this is where I'm going to put the majority of my resources. And yes, I did just create a file by touching it in a shell instead of right-clicking. So one thing to know about OpenTofu is everything. I'm getting 1 second here. I'm getting not sharing my screen. Sorry, 1 second here. I didn't realize I wasn't sharing my screen. There we go. Sorry about that, everybody. I do not know how to use StreamYard apparently. So you missed this. Sorry, there's this providers block over here. And then I ran tofu init over here just to kind of get my stuff up and running and install that module. So I want to go ahead and start working on this main TF. One thing to know about OpenTofu is everything that is in the same directory that ends in .tf is just a part of the same module. So the file names kind of don't matter as long as you have .tf on the end, but there is a convention that people tend to use. And so we'll kind of work through that convention here, but we're just going to start with this main TF. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add a AWS instance. So we're going to do a free tier today. So I'm just going to start with this. We'll type in some more things here. So just a couple of things on the keywords here, though. There is this resource keywords that's define a resource that I'm going to make in the cloud. This is the type of resource. So this is dictated by the provider that you're using. So they'll generally start with the same name as the provider over here. And then the specific type of thing you want to do. So instance, RDS database, Kubernetes cluster, S3 bucket. And then this is the name of this resource in my code, not necessarily the name of the resource in the cloud. So let me say I need to zoom it in a little more. Let me zoom in just a bit more. Hopefully that's good enough. And so this right here is kind of like a variable name in your source code. This is how you'll refer to this instance when we're kind of mixing our code together here. And so there's a couple of things I'm just going to toss in here really quick. I'm going to throw in an AMI. So if you're not familiar with AWS or what AMI means, it's an Amazon machine instance. So this is just the essentially the image of the Linux machine that we're going to be deploying our software to. So this is not a Docker image. It's like a VM image. And this is one of the AWS official Linux images here. So if you want to kind of explore the different images that are out there, you can run the AWS CLI command, and you'll see that there's just a whole slew of images out there that you can use. And this one that we're going to be using today is just the Amazon Linux 2 AMI. I think this one's technically EOL this year, next year. There's a newer version, but there's a lot of AMIs and I couldn't find it. So we'll just go with this one for today. It works. So we'll go ahead and set that up. And then we're going to run this here in just a second. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is before I actually make this instance, I'm just going to play around with a couple of the commands here. So I'm going to go ahead and clear my screen. I'm going to do tofu plan. So we're going to run tofu plan. And what tofu plan does is it gives you an idea of what's going to change about your infrastructure before you actually apply it. And one of the other things it'll do is it'll tell you what attributes are missing if your code's not correct. A couple of other commands that we have here, there's a tofu validate command as well that you can use, and I'll give you that same error message. So validate is really good when you just want to make sure that the code that you're working is correct code. Plan will actually start to interact with the cloud after it does its validation phase to see what is different about your code versus what is in the cloud. And so the first thing that we see here is that there's a couple of values that we need to set on this instance. So I'm going to go ahead and set my instance type, and I'm going to do T2 micro. So if you're trying to stay in the free tier, this will get you free tier. This is about 750 hours a month, so almost a whole month for 12 months on this T2 micro. And yeah, I think that might actually just be enough for us to go ahead and do a tofu plan. So I'm going to run this tofu plan, and we'll hopefully see that it wants to make some changes. So we haven't applied this yet. The plan is just what it wants to do, not actually doing the work. And I want to kind of walk through this and see what we've got here. So you can see that it's referring to this resource that we named. It's an AWS instance that we're just calling this. So why am I calling it this? It's just a kind of a convention that people do in Terraform modules. Sometimes people call it main, this. It's usually the main resource when there's only a single one that module kind of revolves around. So if it was a database, you might just call the database this. You could give it a nice name if you want, but it's never really exposed to the cloud. So it's just something for you to refer to it as. And then what you'll see is a whole list of attributes that we did not list over here that it is going to try to apply to the cloud. And so you'll see a lot of these are known after apply. So what that means is we didn't set a value. There's a default value that the AWS API will apply to this resource. And when I run this, it'll return what that default value was that it picked. Now I can also set all these values as well if I want to control them. But for now, we're just going to kind of keep it as is. And then the one other thing you'll notice here is this tags all. This is an AWS specific thing. This is kind of nice, but on almost every resource in AWS, you can set tags to tag your stuff. As an ops person, I love tags or labels if you're on GCP. And I like to just set the default tags on the AWS provider so all my resources get tags. It makes it easy for me to find and clean up later. The most important thing about this plan, though, is right down here at the bottom. And so you can see here what OpenTofu is telling me is it wants to add one thing to AWS. It's not going to change anything. It's not going to destroy anything. So what I also want to do here is just kind of Whoops. Let me just run tofu plan one more time. So one of the things that's really important here is when I'm making this change, I'm applying this to an API. And I've seen this as a problem that people kind of get caught on a lot with Terraform and OpenTofu that are new to it. Just because this plan says it's going to be successful, and if I apply this right now, it may be successful and come back exit 0, everything's perfect. That does not mean that you didn't break something. So this is one thing to always kind of watch for is watching for this change and destroy to see if the change you're expecting to happen is what's happening. I'm expecting to add something. But occasionally when you change an attribute about a cloud resource, it will destroy it and recreate it. And that's something really important to watch for, especially when you're working with databases. There's tools like OPA that you can use, and there's lifecycle hooks in Terraform that you can kind of halt disruptions from happening if you don't intend to do them. But I always like to watch the plan to make sure what I'm doing is what I'm hoping that the tool does. So that's just the plan real quick. We'll go ahead and I'm going to add a few more attributes to this resource just so we can see some real infrastructure boot up and access it. So what I'm going to do is a couple of things. So again, this is not a course on security. My instance. So I'm going to go ahead and just expose a public IP address on this instance. IP addresses in AWS are in the free tier with some constraints, but if this is your first instance, you should be fine. And I'm also going to just tag this instance right now. We're going to come back and use a variable to set the name of this instance in a minute. And then the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just copy a blob of information here really quick. And I'm going to do docker run -d -p 80 nginx. Ooh, I love that autocomplete. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to push this instance up, start to build it, and I just got some user data here to set up this machine. So what I should get from this is a running nginx with like nginx's typical hello world. So we'll go ahead and apply this, see what an actual application does in OpenTofu, and then we'll kind of iterate on this instance from here. So let's go ahead and do a tofu apply. So the first thing it's going to do is it's going to prompt me to see if I want to do this. There is a flag that you can add to tofu apply called auto approve that will just skip this phase and apply your changes. We'll probably do that a lot from here on out. I just like to show this as an option. So we'll go ahead and apply that. And this should just take a minute or two, and then we will be able to hit that nginx instance. So while that is running, what I do want to do is talk a bit more about plans, because plans are really important. So what we're doing right now is an apply without a plan. We did the plan and we saw it, but we're just applying kind of ad hoc right now. And what that means is that plan that we ran earlier was how the tool wanted to interact with the API at that point in time. And now as we're running this apply, it's how the tool wants to interact with that API at this point in time. So when I ran that plan versus when I ran this apply, if anything changed about this instance or my environment, that's ambiguity to the tool. And so one of the things that you can do with plans is you can set outputs. You can say plan out, and this will actually write a binary file of the instructions it wants to do. And so what this allows you to do is have better guarantees that the plan that you just saw is actually what the tool's going to do, right? So if this instance was created called my instance in between these two commands being run, OpenTofu might not be able to make that instance, right? Or if somebody changed an attribute because they're clicking around in the AWS console, I might think I'm changing a value, but it may have changed out from underneath me. And so generally what you'll want to do when you start working with CI systems is use especially in systems where people are working on a lot of different resources, is use these plans and write the file out first, and then use that as the input to your apply. So we won't do that a whole bunch in this session just because it's a lot of extra typing. But as you start to work with teams and CI with your infrastructure as code, you'll want to use the out option for plan and then pass that plan into apply. So what I'm going to do is, I don't know if you caught that, but this apply completed. You can see that it added one resource. I know that my instance is there. This is super cool. But the thing that sucks right now is I don't know anything about that instance. So what I want to do is kind of introduce you to the next little piece here, which is something called outputs. So I'm going to go ahead and just touch a file called outputs.tf. And then I'll open that file. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add an output. And so what outputs are is pretty much two things. An output one will provide information on the screen after an apply, telling you the information that you're wanting to output. It can also be used for interlinking different modules, And so we're going to get into that in a few more weeks, but you can essentially use it to pull information from one OpenTofu run into another. But today we're just going to use it to kind of see what's going on. So I'm just going to go ahead and add this output. I'm going to go ahead and run tofu apply again, and I'm just going to go ahead and do auto approve. And what we should see is that no changes happen, but now we're going to get some output that tells me the ARN of this instance. There we go. So now I know what this instance's ARN is. If you remember, I did set that this had a public IP address. So one of the things I can do is I can also add an output here to output that IP address. And so what you're seeing is these outputs are essentially the things that I'm going to be presenting on the screen. This is the key that's going to be there. So you can see this instance ARN. And this is the value that I want to put there. So what I'm doing is I'm starting to reference some of these resources. This is the type of resource I'm referencing. This is the specific resource that I'm referencing by name, as we saw here. And then this is the attribute that I want to get. So if you have, either Terraform or OpenTofu VS Code plugins, a lot of these will autocomplete, but these are all available on the Terraform docs. You can see what all of these attributes are for the providers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to output this IP address. And again, I don't have SSL or anything set up with this, trying to keep it to the bare minimum. So we're going to access this over HTTP. So I'll run this one more time. And what you'll see is it's going to print the instance URL as well. And now anybody should be able to hit this. And hopefully we have an Nginx instance come up. I'm just going to check over here on my sidebar. Oh, no, we don't have an instance coming up. And I will tell you why. Because the next part that we need to add. So the instance did get provisioned. We saw that come back, but we can't hit it. So anybody who is an AWS networking expert knows it's because that this instance actually can't get the Docker hub to download this. We need to add a security group. So we're going to go ahead and add our first additional resource here. And that is going to be a security group. So I'm going to hop back over to this main. We've got this instance. It's trying to download this from Docker. I'm going to go ahead and add two things here. First, actually, let me take this out really quick. First, I want to go ahead and I want to name this instance using a variable. So I'm going to add a concept called a variable. And I'm going to move this to a variables file in just a second. I'm going to give it the type of string, and I'm going to give it a default of my instance. And so what variables let you do is start to variabilize your modules. These create interfaces when you're starting to make reusable modules. But for this case right here, it lets us just kind of set these values once, be able to reference them from multiple places, and kind of change the way that the execution of this happens by executing it with different variables. So I'm going to say var.name prefix here to set my name prefix. And I generally wouldn't set a default for something that should be unique. It's just nice in this scenario. It's going to make the command a little easier, but I'll show a couple different ways of running this. So again, this instance is up. We can't access it because it's not running Nginx yet because it doesn't have the ability to get the Docker hub. We'll add that in 1 second, but I want to show how this name prefix works really quick. So I'm going to take this default out first, and I'm going to run tofu apply one more time. And what you'll see is now that I have a variable that doesn't have a default, it's going to prompt me for it. So if I type in my instance, which is what I had there before, I now have code that is exactly the same as my last run, so there should be no changes. If I were to do something like applying this, and I wanted to call this OpenTofu Foundations, and if I did a plan, it would prompt me for this same information as well. You can see it does want to make changes. You can see that it changed the name of that resource, and it showed me here what it was planning to change. So that's pretty cool. So I can start using these variables now across all of my different resources. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to move this to a variables file really quick, just so I'm following the conventions of OpenTofu and Terraform. Throw this here. And now I'm going to go ahead and add this security group. So what this security group is going to do is two things. One, it's going to allow traffic to my bunch of notes here. Get this out of the way. This one's the most important down there. So this is going to allow inbound HTTP traffic. It's also going to allow this to get out to Docker Hub. And so you can see here, so I'm also using this name prefix. This is eventually going to be WordPress as we kind of work through this today. But I'm also using this name prefix here to name my security group that's allowing it to have these different interactions. So I'm going to go ahead and apply this. I will need to make one more change to my resource up here. And we're going to run a plan first so we can actually see what OpenTofu wants to do. So the other thing I need to add here is essentially something saying that this instance can use this security group. So I'll go ahead and do VPC, security group IDs. And now I can reference this resource just like I've referenced the resources in the output so far and how I've kind of referenced variables using this dot address. So I can do AWS security group. You can see it auto-completed, WordPress ID there. And so what I'm doing is I'm going to create this security group. And I'm also saying update this AWS instance to set that it is allowed to use this security group. And so now if I run this tofu plan over here, I should see hopefully that it plans to change my existing instance and create a security group. And what's kind of cool about the way that this works is behind the scenes, not to get all PhD on you, but there's this thing called the DAG, a directed acyclic graph, and it allows the declarative code to manage its own dependencies. So by referencing this WordPress instance, I've told OpenTofu that you have to create this thing first because I depend on it. And so this is really cool. It takes care of a lot of the ordering, getting stuff created in the right order, like you'd normally do with a bunch of ifs blocks and whatnot, and putting things in the right order in a bash file or a Python file. It does it all for you. So no matter where I move this WordPress block to a different file, maybe I want to make a security groups.tf, maybe I want to move it above this instance. It doesn't matter where I put it. OpenTofu will look at these references and organize the directed acyclic graph and create the resources in the correct order. So you can see it's prompting for my name over here. So what I want to go ahead and do is show you one other way to run this plan. And that is going to be using something called a var file. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to touch my .tf vars really quick. And what this allows you to do is set your variable names in a config file. So I know that I've got this variable name called name prefix, and I'm just going to call this my instance. And what I can do is instead of being prompted for this constantly, I can say var file, my TF vars, and it will use my var file to fill in all the variables that I need. And so we can see here is there's one change, one thing to add, and now I can kind of take a gander at this plan. So if I scroll back up to the top, you can see that it's going to change this name back from OpenTofu to my instance. It's also going to change the tags that are using that same, it's going to change the tags that are using that variable. And you can also see it's going to add this security group ID, and it's also going to create a security group. So I'm going to go ahead and do an apply now to apply these changes. And I'm going to go ahead and add auto approve so it doesn't prompt me for a yes. And again, my team is in the community channel. So if there's any questions as we're going, or if there's any issues that you're having with the code, feel free to ask questions over there. And they'll be able to kind of help you with any issues that you have. So now we have hopefully something that's able to connect to Docker Hub. Now, I know this is AWSism, but it gives us the opportunity to use a really neat command in OpenTofu. So that user data block does not get reevaluated by that EC2 instance. It's kind of running. It's failed to download Docker because it couldn't get out, and it's not going to rerun that user data block. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to destroy that instance and recreate it. And so OpenTofu has a command for this. It's called taint. And so you can essentially say this thing, it needs to be destroyed and recreated. And the way that you reference that is by address. So I can say t OpenTofu taint AWS instance.this. And what it's going to do is it's going to mark it as tainted. And now if I run a plan, what you're going to see is it's going to want to destroy that instance and recreate it. Now, this is not the way that this is not the way that I would suggest deploying applications. But again, if we're trying to keep this to the bare minimum AWS as possible, this is a really nice way to just kind of recycle this instance. And so you can see here, it's going to destroy that instance, and then it's going to recreate it. And it expects that these outputs are going to change. So I'll go ahead and do this apply. And we should see this thing get destroyed and recreated. And then hopefully after about 30 seconds, it should download that Docker image, boot up Nginx, and then we'll be able to move on to the next thing. So while that's running, what I want to go ahead and do is go ahead and add one more variable here. So I'll open up this variables file. And right now, we just kind of have Nginx hard-coded into that data block. What I want to do is allow whoever's using this module to deploy whatever container they want. Maybe they have their own WordPress image that they want to run. Maybe they want to run the official one. Maybe they want to run a specific tag. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a variable here called image for the Docker image. And I want to show like one of the really nice things about the type system going into an OpenTofu module. So you have this concept of rich type. So it doesn't have to just be a string or a Boolean. You can do things like actual objects. So this hasn't been a feature that's been in the Terraform code base for a long time. It's been in, I think, since like 1.0 or so. And before, if you're looking at older code bases, you'll see a lot of really flat variables where it's just like hundreds of variables. And so now you can actually nest and design data structures to input into your modules. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this up so that it can take a name for this image, and it can also take a tag. And one of the other things you can do is you can set defaults here. So if I want to go ahead and set some defaults for my team that's going to be using this, I can just go ahead and say, hey, we'll do Nginx and we'll do latest, because who doesn't love deploying latest? And so now I've created a new variable so I can start to input this information. I'll have to put this in my TF bars as well. Otherwise, I'll get prompted for it unless I have a default. So we'll use this here in a second as we start to switch over to WordPress from Nginx. But first, I want to see if this instance came up. So let me go ahead and grab this IP address. If you are following along and you tainted and redestroyed this, the IP address probably changed. So just keep that in mind. Okie dokie. Okay, let me see if I got anything I've messed up over here. This is part of the life of writing infrastructure as code is realizing what you don't remember about the cloud. Spend a lot of time in Kubernetes, not a lot of time with EC2 instances. So let me just double check to make sure I didn't miss anything over here. I got this security group added. I did taint this. I am looking at, just go ahead, Docker, how did my Docker, set the run background. Okay, maybe it's just taking a second. Let me just check one more time, see if it's up yet. There we go. So if you hit this URL, I'll drop it in the comments here really quick. You should see an Nginx instance. Note that it's over HTTP. So if you're using a browser that wants to switch it back to HTTPS, you'll have to manually change that. So that instance is up. This is great. So what we're going to do now is we're going to start walking through building the database for WordPress. That takes like 10 minutes to run. And so we'll get that set up, even though this is running Nginx. And while that's running, we'll start to make the code changes so that we can run WordPress on this instance. But we are good to go. The security group is set up and working right, so we can access Docker Hub. All of our code is looking good so far to actually build one of these instances. So let's go ahead and start to make a database. So again, I'm just adding everything to this main TF. This directory, every TF file in here kind of just gets concatenated together into one file and executed. So if you want to start breaking this up, if you want to have no main.tf and you instead want ec2.tf and rds.tf, that's cool. You can do that. I'm going to do this in one file just so it's easier for me to kind of scroll around and whatnot. But I'm going to go ahead and add this next resource here. So we'll do another resource. Again, this is saying that I want to make something in the cloud. There's a whole host of these resources, almost one for every single service resource type in AWS. I'm going to make a DB instance. And so one thing to note, this is like mildly frustrating, but the names of the types of resources don't always directly map to the cloud service name. So you'll probably find yourself a lot of times in the provider documentation trying to find the resource names. But I'm going to go ahead and add a DB instance. Again, I'm calling it this. I'm only expecting to have a single MariaDB instance here. I might have replicas in the future. When I have replicas in the future, I'll probably change this to primary. You can change variable names. You do have to do something called state surgery or state changes to do this, but I might call this primary in the future, and maybe I'll add another resource as a set of replicas. But for today, I just have a single one, so I'm just going to call it this, and we'll start to set this up. So the first thing I'm going to do is I love having a naming convention in my modules. So I've got this name prefix that's coming in. I'm going to use this everywhere I can to name things, and I'll add suffixes as the operator writing this so that my user doesn't have to worry about it. One of the things I see a lot of times is every single identifier inside of a module and every single name being exposed as a variable. And that's fine if you need to do that. But the cognitive overhead of somebody who's just trying to use this module now has to think of, okay, there's 15 things in it. What are the 15 names I want to use? And we all know that one of the hardest things in computer science is naming things. So why don't we handle that for people? So I'm going to use this name prefix, and I'm going to go ahead and set up a couple other things here. So I'm going to add the instance class that I want this DB instance to run as. I'm going to run it as a DB T3 micro, which also sits in the free tier. You'll get about 700 and something hours for up to a year. I'm going to do the allocated storage as well. You get about 20 gigabytes. That's the amount of storage I want in gigabytes. I'm going to set the engine here to MariahDB. And if it feels like I'm blasting through these attributes quickly, I apologize. Again, like this is the AWS level stuff. Like we need to know it if we're managing AWS, but as me, as somebody who uses OpenTofu and Terraform pretty frequently, these are just attributes of this resource. So I don't want to spend too much time going through each one of these. I more want to focus on just like what this resource is going to do when OpenTofu goes to provision it. So I'm going to set this to MariahDB, and then I'm going to set the engine version to not that version, 10.6, I think was I had to look through some WordPress compatibility matrix stuff, which is riveting. And then a couple other things we need to set here is we need to set the database name. I'm just going to set this to WordPress. And we also need to set the username to access this database. I'm just going to set it to admin, and then also set the password. And I'm just going to set this to super good password. Now, you might be thinking, holy moly, he just typed his password right here in the code. This is fine. It's going to be in a VPC. You can't get to it anyway, but I wouldn't do this in OpenTofu. So a number of reasons. Every single cloud has some sort of secrets management tool that you can use. So I'd probably lean on that. You can also set this as a variable and route that in so that the user of this module can set what their password is. We can do that. Maybe that'll be a little challenge for you afterwards, is to kind of set that password through a variable. But I'm just going to set it here for now, just so we have less things to think about and can kind of focus on the OpenTofu-ness. And then I'm going to do one other thing really quick. I'm just going to set the final snapshot to skip. And so when you tear this stuff down, AWS will take a snapshot of the database and store it. That stuff can eventually cost you money. So if we just set skips final snapshot to true, it won't take that final database dump. So now we should go ahead and be able to do a tofu plan. We should hopefully see, set my var file. You see that it's going to make that WordPress security group, and it wants to make this database. Now, I'm going to kind of go ahead and skip ahead to something I know that's going to happen, just so that we don't have to wait on this later. I am going to add one more security group here. And this security group is going to just allow traffic between the WordPress instance and this MariahDB once it's stood up. So I'm going to go ahead and add this here really quick. Just kind of copied and pasted that, but it's a lot of the same. So it's a security group. I'm going to take this out for now. It's something I'll show you all a little later. And then I'm just saying allow traffic from 3306 to 3306 over TCP. And you see I'm using this name prefix here, and then I'm giving you a little suffix. I don't want to prompt somebody for every single security group name. And the one other thing I'll do here is I'm going to, just like I did with the instance up here where I have the security group IDs, I'm going to go ahead and assign a security group ID to this right here. That autocomplete isn't working for some reason. There we go. So we'll go ahead and get that security group created and associated while we're working through this. So I'll go ahead and do tofu apply dash var file, my var file. And this will go ahead and start to set up this database. Now, this is going to take a couple of minutes. Oh, I left out my data block. So what is this here? So this is one other little thing for us to go ahead and check out. So right now, I haven't specified any VPC, virtual private cloud, for my instances to run in. I'm just running in the default AWS one that they give you. And what you may have noticed down here when I kind of copied and pasted this was I refer to a CIDR block of this network. So I need to get that information. So you can do this by taking an input, but there's also this thing called a data resource. And what this effectively lets you do, it's a part of the provider. You can see it starts with the provider name here. What this lets you do is it lets you read information from the cloud and then use that in your Terraform module. And so this is a great way to be able to get information about other resources when you need to start connecting stuff together. Like, let's say I've built a database and the output of it is the endpoint and the credentials, and I want to pass that into an application. Instead of me taking the username and password and putting it as inputs to my applications module, I can just have my application take maybe the AWS Secret Manager ID. And so now I can use the data lookup to look up that secret, pull that secret value into my infrastructure and use it without copying and pasting passwords around or putting passwords into variable files. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look up the default AWS VPC that I'm in, and I'm going to get the CIDR block from that. So you can see that's what I'm kind of doing right here. So we'll go ahead and just do tvalidate to make sure this looks good. Again, validate will make sure the code looks good. One of the really cool command here, by the way, I almost never format anything anymore. Between Go and OpenTofu, there's a format command that'll just reformat your code. I don't care about code formatting anymore. I just run that all the time. So now that my code's formatted, it's valid. I can go ahead and apply this. Again, if this was production, I would be wanting to run a plan, output it to that binary file, and then pass it in. But for here, we actually want to kind of see this plan and walk through it real quick. So you can see, one, it's going to set up this DB instance. You can see some of the values that I set here. And then down here, this instance here is going to get updated with an additional security group. It'll know those values after it's applied. And then you can see this additional security group getting created down here and getting tagged. So I'm going to go ahead and say, yes, I want to do this. And this is going to run for probably 10 minutes. So while this is running, what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to start working on this code to get WordPress running, so that once this is done, we can redeploy the CC2 instance and we should have an end-to-end working WordPress install. Why are we doing WordPress? Because nobody on Reddit gave me a better idea of something fun to run. So we're going to be boring, but the marketing team's going to love it. Okay, so let's go ahead, and while that's running, let's hop back over here. And I'm just going to kind of work on this user data block here. So again, setting the user data on a specific instance. It's really funny. It's actually auto-completing. Well, that's auto-completing something goofy. Setting the user data on an instance is a really good way to get something up and running quickly. This is honestly, like, I have a dev machine that I occasionally develop in the cloud with, and this is how I set up my dev machine. But for production infrastructure, you'll want to use things like launch templates or ECS and AWS. And that's one of the challenges I'll put in the GitHub repo is taking this code and changing it to use something like a launch template. But for now, we're just going to hard code in some additional values here. So the first thing I want to do is take advantage of that, that image variable that I set up earlier. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back over to my variables here. Remember, I set up this image variable that takes a name and a tag. And what I'm going to do is say image equals name WordPress, tag equals latest. And like, I'm living wild here, going with latest. I really hope nobody's pushed something crazy overnight to the WordPress repo that ruins this demo. So we're going to roll with it though. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that variable now here. So I'm going to go ahead and do docker run -d. I'm going to put a bunch of environment variables here in a minute. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and map port 80 to port 80. Yes, I know this should be read-only. Yes, I know it shouldn't be running as root. Yes, I know we should be dropping capabilities, but we're just trying to get this guy up and running. And so now what I'm going to do is, you notice that curly brace there. I'm going to start doing some interpolation. So I'm going to say var.image.name. There we go. var.image.tag. So Now what I'm doing here is this is a multi-line string, and I'm using variable interpolation just like I did with setting the name down here for WordPress. So you do have this multi-line string in OpenTofu that you can use. This is going to take the image name and tag from my variables when I pass it in. And then a couple other things that we're going to do here is set up some of the environment variables that I know this needs to run. So there is WordPress DB host. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and reference this resource that it's going to build. So it'll actually be able to get the address from this resource and interpolate it in here. An exercise for you all that I'll put in the GitHub repo afterwards is to use AWS Secrets Manager to store the secrets from that resource and then pull them into this so that we're not interpolating them here. And then I'll go ahead and I'm just going to kind of just hard code these values in for now. Equals admin. And we can reference these in variables here in just a minute, but we'll just get it up and running first. Super good password. There we go. That is a really good password. That's actually the password I use for my email. I use it for my GitHub. Pretty much use it for everything. That's a joke. So that should be all we need. We'll go ahead and rip out this Nginx instance here. So that should bring up WordPress in this Docker image. Looks like that database just finished, which is fantastic. And we should be able to run this. But again, this is an AWS-ism. This user data block isn't going to get reevaluated by me deploying this. And I'll show you this really quick because this is one of those things. It's like I feel like when people start using infrastructure as code, they conflate learning infrastructure as code and the problems there with the nuances and strangeness of the cloud APIs. So if I do a tofu plan here and I pass in this var file, we all know that this user data block just changed, right? We just saw that change. So if I run this tofu plan, what we're going to see is OpenTofu is going to also understand that this changed. So you can see there's this little digest here. So you can see like something about this user data changed. But AWS just doesn't do anything when the user data changes. So what we actually have to do here is we have to taint this one more time so that we destroy it and recreate it. And then it'll bring it up with this WordPress config that we put on here. So I'll go ahead and taint that really quick. I'm going to go ahead and just give one more peek through this to make sure everything looks good before we apply this and waste time waiting for an apply and I missed something. So it looks like we've got the data lookup here, pulling the default VPC information. I could also take in a VPC ID if I'm running in my own VPC. I have this AWS instance here, which should have access to this MariaDB instance. I'm going to do something real lame. I can't remember if MariaDB also needs to specifically have allow access. So I'm just going to go ahead and use that same security rule there, just in case. I'm sure somebody who's a networking guru will be like, silly goose. We've got the user data all set up. That looks pretty good. We're referencing the instance that just was built. We're hard coding these values now. We can either use variables for this or SSM or secrets manager, but we'll just keep this as is now. Use the name prefix to tag this instance. Using the name prefix to identify this instance. We can tag it as well if we want, just so you guys know. So we have that tags all that's getting applied at the top. But if I wanted to put this same name tag here, I can do that here as well. And so that'll add that on. So one thing to note here is we'll get into the concept of blocks and dynamic blocks in a few weeks. But what I'm doing right here is I'm essentially setting a map value to be this tag. So it's got this equal sign. So sometimes in Terraform, you will see things like no equal sign, and sometimes there are equal signs. And so these just have different ways that they're executed against the code. And there's very specific places where they're used and not used. So we'll get into that in a few weeks, but I just wanted to point that out for anybody who'd noticed that syntax difference. One other thing is I like to use the equal sign. Some people like to use the colon here. Some people like to do strings here. There's a couple different ways just from the years of Terraform existing, the syntax on maps that you can use, but this is the syntax I typically use. Looks like these security groups look good. I think we're good to go. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. I'm going to do a tofu plan one more time. Okay, and so it looks like we've got one change, one destroy, and one add. So let's take a gander at what this is planning to do. So it is going to change this instance. So it's going to add the additional security group to the database instance. It's also going to add this tag for the name. You can see that the instance here, this is the one that we tainted, so it's going to replace it. So again, this is one of these things like you want to be watching for if you're running this manually. Did I intend for this to get destroyed and recreated? Yes, I did. Can you make a change to your application or your module that will just destroy and recreate things without you intending to do so? You absolutely can. And I have a good friend that I will not call out by name who destroyed a production database, not once, but twice in the same day because they missed this replace here. So watch for it and use tools like OPA to kind of catch those where you're not expecting to see like a database get destroyed and recreated. But we should be good. We will see that our outputs are going to change here. The instance ID is going to get destroyed and recreated. I'm going to end up getting a new IP address. So if you're following along and you've got your Nginx page open, when you refresh it, it won't be there anymore. You'll get a new IP address here in just a second. So I'm going to go ahead and apply this. I'm going to double check my outputs or my variables really quick just to make sure I got WordPress. Okay, it looks good. So let's go ahead and apply this. So it's refreshing the state. So what's going on here, we've seen this a couple of times, but now we got a lot of resources that are created and changing. So it's a little more interesting to look at. What's happening here is you can actually see the DAG working. So you can see it's like, okay, I got to get this first because it doesn't reference anything, but other things reference it. And then it's getting WordPress. And so it'll actually parallelize and do multiple DAGs at the same time if there are multiple. And you can actually control the parallelism of OpenTofu using environment variables. So by default, I think it uses the number of cores on your machine, but you can tune it down to 1 or expand it depending on how fast you need it to go. But you can kind of see what it's planning to do. So it's refreshing the state. It's getting information here. It's just reading. There's no state to refresh. Here, it's got the local state file, which we're going to get in the state files in a few weeks. But it's looking at the local state of what I have about this machine and the remote state on the cloud to figure out what's different, figuring out the how to get there. And that's how it's coming up with this plan that we see here. So it looks like it's ready to go. I'm going to go ahead and type in yes. And if so, if this works, hopefully none of us will get cease and desist letters from Automatic. That's a open source joke. I don't know if y'all saw that, but just some more fun cease and desist and licensing issues out there. I spend too much time online, but we're going to go ahead and watch this run. It's going to take just a second here. I'm just going to check in over here to see if there's anything that I can answer live. Again, if you haven't been in the Slack, my co-founders and teammates are there helping people with any issues that they have. Ben is right. I did not put a special character in that password, so it can't actually be super good. It's super okay. It was a super okay password. If I put a special character in it, it would have actually been a super good password. But you all know that we actually need 3 different characters to make it a really, really good password. The more complex it is, the more likely you have to hit that show button, right? So you can remember what it was. I love it. Okie doke. So that looks like it's going. I think that's going to be all that we need to do here to get this. And again, I'll just recap while we're waiting for this, and hopefully we see WordPress come up here in just a second. The goal of today was not to become an AWS master and a security expert. The goal was really for us to see some of these low-level primitives of OpenTofu and get an idea of how it works. And we're going to build on this over the next 4 weeks. So one of my teammates is going to take this code that we have here for week 2, and they're going to repackage it into a couple of different modules that we can use together to build the same infrastructure, but in a more modular way. From there, we're going to move on to how do I deploy a staging and a production version of this? How do I make it more fault tolerant? How do I make it more secure? And so kind of between the sessions that we're going to go through over the next few weeks and the challenges that we post on GitHub, hopefully by week 5, you'll have a really solid WordPress instance up and running. Or if you all want to switch to something else like Minecraft or Roblox or whatever that you want to self-host and run, feel free to do that. But we'll be kind of sticking to this. So you can see that modifications are run on the database instance. You can see it tore down that original instance. This is up. It's probably going to take a few minutes to pull that image, but hopefully we should have a WordPress instance. So I'm going to go ahead and grab that URL. This is the part that always makes me panic. I'm like, how how fast is this Docker image downloading right now? How many gigabytes are in a WordPress Docker image? Is it 200? Is it 1? Okie dokie. Looks like it's still pulling. Nico, that's pretty funny. So Nico just said in the chat, make your password invalid so that when something tells me that the password's invalid, it'll tell me what my password is, and I never forget my password again. That's actually that's a great strategy. We got to get NIST to update their rules. Not their rules, their recommendations, I guess. Okay, it looks like we have a WordPress instance coming up. So I'm going to go ahead and change the screen share that I've got here real quick. And if you're following along, you should see this WordPress install. So I'm going to go ahead and hit continue. Oh my gosh, look at that password. It auto-generated a nice one. So we're going to go ahead and make DevOps dudes. This is going to be our blog. We're going to move the Mass-Driver blog to this for sure. I'm going to be Corey. Super good password. 1. Oh my gosh, it won't even take that. Let me see how many exclamation points. That's about 5 of them. Very cool. So you all can see this password. You can access this machine if you want. I don't care. I'm going to tear it down here in a second, which is going to be the last lesson I give you all. I'm going to hit install WordPress, and bingo, bango, bongo, we are ready to start our own WordPress hosting business. That's pretty exciting. So that's pretty cool. Now, the one thing I do want to point out, especially people that are on free tier that aren't using, company credit cards to pay for their infrastructure, tear this down. So let me just go ahead and flip back over to my code really quick, because I think the most important thing that you can do in learning how to automate infrastructure is remember to tear stuff down so you don't have to buy a bunch of cost tools to figure out what you left running. So I'll show you all how to do that really quick. Tofu destroy. Guess what? It needs my name prefix. You can pass in variables here as well. Go ahead, tofu destroy. And what this is going to do is it's going to tear down this entire infrastructure. So I will say one thing here. It is very common. Go ahead and hit yes. I would tear this down over and over again. Get used to it. Get comfortable with it. It's fun. I love tearing stuff down. But it gets you in that good habit of, like, as you're playing with things locally, just constantly tearing them down, understanding that the code that we're looking at right here is going to recreate the same thing. Like, be comfortable with it. Now, obviously, I wouldn't tear down prod all the time unless, like, you're trying to figure out if that disaster recovery plan actually works. But but like tearing it down, I think, is one of those things, like, when you're working through it, it kind of breaks that pet mentality that we have a lot of times with infrastructure. I've seen a lot of people that go through, Terraform tutorials or Pulumi tutorials, and they, like, leave the thing up and running because they're new and they're used to it and they got something that works. But that's the nice part about declarative code. It works. I don't have to worry about weird side effects. Like, the only thing that's going to make this Terraform module not work is if I'm using a unique value or I plan to use a unique value and somebody else made that resource in my cloud account. So getting that flow down of, like, working through things, just destroying it when you're done, I think really gets us in that mentality of, like, this infrastructure is cattle. Like, we shouldn't be dependent on the cloud kind of being our source of truth, like our code is. And if we need this thing back, I can bring it back easily. And also, you only get 700 and something hours of this thing a month. So if you're planning to do a bunch of building out and playing with different things, like, it's nice to save that compute. Yeah, Rod Stewart. If your name is actually Rod Stewart, hold on. Is this somebody? This is a funny name. Is this somebody that happens to have the same name, or is Rod Stewart actually here? This would be. I mean, I know Kelsey is bringing some attention, but I can't imagine Rod Stewart showed up for Kelsey. Rod Stewart has a great point. Constantly doing these Terraform destroys during development stops you from having the first apply issue. Yeah, there we go. Thank you for putting that up there. So, like, what this is like, there are quirks, right? I mean, it's software. Everything's weird. There's things full of gremlins, right? So, like, sometimes things will just work on the first apply, and sometimes what you'll see is, like, as you added a bunch of code, a subsequent apply might look like it works, but there's some sort of inconsistency that if it was built from scratch, it wouldn't. And so doing this constant teardown kind of gives you a fresh slate, so you know that my code truly is the snapshot of what's going to be built. I really appreciate that for putting that there. It is his real name, or it is the real Rod Stewart. I don't know, but I love it. So that's it for this week. So hopefully this was interesting. Hopefully it was exciting. Hopefully I didn't put our logo in too many places. But we have another one next week. It's going to build from this. We're going to start from the same code. We're going to start to package this up. I've already put this code up on GitHub. There's going to be a full walkthrough of everything we did today, piece by piece. So you'll have the final code. You'll have how I got there. I haven't put the walkthrough up yet. I'm just kind of punching it up right now. And this video, we're going to put it up on YouTube so you can all check it out there. And our Slack community, it's mostly for our customers, but that OpenTofu channel, treat it as yours. Feel free to ask us any questions there. If you've got any questions about how to use OpenTofu, any issues with any of the week's challenges that we put out there, any questions that you have, we're happy to answer those. Thank you, Jacob. Really glad to see you, dude. Glad you got to make it. Yeah, awesome. All. Thanks so much. I was trying to end it, but I don't know how to end it. Oh gosh, I'm so much better at Kubernetes than everything else. Okie dokie, here we go.